had been planning that solo hike for almost a year. I didn't care about how people said it was better to hike with a partner. I liked being alone. I didn't go to the woods looking for peace or some kind of spiritual thing. I just liked the silence, the physical challenge, and being far from people, especially after the year I had just come out of. Work had been nonstop stress, and I needed to reset. I picked a trail in a place I hadn't been before, northern Idaho, near the Canadian border. It wasn't famous or busy, and that was what I wanted. Quiet. The plan was simple. 5 days, in and out. I'd park my car at the Forest Service Road, hike about 30 miles out through the woods, loop around, then come back to my car. I had mapped it out carefully. I double-checked the topographic maps. I had food for a week, extra just in case, a new filter for water, an emergency beacon, and a first aid kit that weighed more than it probably should have. I wasn't new to this. I had done trips like this plenty of times before. The first day went smoothly. I got to the trailhead early in the morning. The forest was cool, and the air smelled like pine needles and dirt. I hiked for about 10 miles that first day, following the ridge for most of it. The trees opened up here and there, giving me a clear view of the valleys. I didn't see a single person, which was perfect. I set up camp next to a small creek, ate some dehydrated chili, listened to the water flowing while I leaned against a tree, and slept early. The second day started just as well. The trail dipped down into denser forest, thick underbrush, a lot of downed trees. It slowed me down a little, but I had expected that. I stopped around 3 p.m. to refill my water from a shallow stream. I used my filter and drank slowly while looking at the map again, just to stay on track. That's when I saw it. A narrow side trail, barely more than a game path heading off to the west. It wasn't on my map, but I noticed something weird. My GPS showed a lake maybe 1.5 miles in that direction. The lake wasn't marked on my paper map either. I looked up from the screen and down the path. It was overgrown but passable. I wasn't in a hurry. I figured I could hike to the lake, check it out, maybe eat lunch there, then come back and rejoin my route before nightfall. It didn't seem like a bad idea, so I went off trail. Right away, the woods felt different. The air was thicker somehow. The trees were closer together, and the sun barely got through the canopy. The sound of birds faded the deeper I went. I kept walking, watching the GPS. I pushed through thick branches, had to duck under fallen trees, and climbed over logs. After maybe 45 minutes, I reached the lake. It was small and still. The surface was smooth like glass. I didn't see fish or birds, just the water, still and dark, surrounded by mossy rocks and thick trees. I sat down on a flat boulder and opened a protein bar. The whole place felt untouched. Too untouched. I usually found wrappers or fire rings near spots like that, but this place felt like no one had ever been there before. Not in a long time. I didn't stay long. Something about it made me feel uneasy. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, but it was just too quiet. I packed up and decided to go back the way I came. Except I couldn't find the way I came. I knew I had come down a narrow path. I had been careful. I even snapped a small branch with a bright yellow cord tied to it when I passed earlier, something I did sometimes to mark my route in dense woods. But now I didn't see it. I walked in the direction I thought was right, but after 15 minutes of pushing through underbrush, I knew I had gotten turned around. I took out the GPS again. The screen froze. The map didn't load. I turned it off and on. Still frozen. I pulled out the compass and checked the direction. Then I pulled out the paper map and tried to line everything up, but the forest didn't match anything on the map. It was already after 4 p.m., and the light was fading under the trees. I didn't panic, but I started moving faster. I picked a direction, east, and pushed hard, hoping I'd hit the original trail. I didn't. The forest got denser, darker. The brush scratched my legs through my pants. Branches slapped at my face. I slipped twice on wet ground. One fall cut my palm on a jagged rock. It stung and bled a little. I wrapped it with gauze. I kept walking. It got dark fast. I realized I had to stop for the night. I found a patch of flat ground between 2 thick trees and set up my tent. I boiled some water and made another bag meal. I ate without tasting it. I wasn't scared yet. Not fully. I had food, water, shelter. I could find my way back in the morning. That night was cold. Too cold for summer. I zipped up tight in my sleeping bag, but I woke up over and over again. I kept hearing twigs snap outside the tent. I told myself it was deer or raccoons, but it felt closer than that. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps. Slow, crunching leaves, then stopping. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening. It was pitch black. I didn't even want to open the tent flap and look. When I finally fell asleep again, it was already getting light outside. I packed up fast and started walking as soon as I could. I kept heading east. I rationed my water now, taking small sips. I was sweating more, moving faster, heart pounding the whole time. Around midday, I found a small clearing and climbed a tree to get a better view. The forest stretched out in every direction. I didn't see the trail. I didn't see my marker trees. Nothing looked familiar. I climbed back down and kept walking. I hiked all day. No trail, no road, just more woods. At one point, I heard a plane overhead. I tried to wave, but it was far too high. I realized then how deep in the woods I was. No one would hear me yell. I was entirely alone out there. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I just rolled out the sleeping bag under a pine tree and stared up at the branches. I didn't even cook. I was too tired. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached from the pack. I kept hearing sounds. Not animals, or not the ones I was used to. Quick rustling, like something darting between trees. But I never saw anything. I fell asleep from pure exhaustion. The next morning, I checked the GPS again. Still frozen. I took out the batteries, waited, then put them back in. Nothing. The screen stayed white. I cursed under my breath and kept walking. The food was down to 2 days now. The water was almost gone. I had passed a couple of creeks but hadn't filled up because they were too muddy or stagnant. That afternoon, I tripped over a root and landed hard on my side. I felt something crack in my shoulder. The pain was sharp, deep, like a knife stuck under the bone. I laid there on the forest floor for maybe 10 minutes, not moving. I finally forced myself to sit up. My right arm didn't move well. I could still walk, but it hurt bad. I made a sling with a bandana and kept going. I didn't sleep well that night either. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd jolt awake. I started hearing voices in the wind. Not words, just whispers. I knew they weren't real, just my brain playing tricks on me. On day 5, I decided I couldn't keep wandering. I needed to find water first. I hiked down a long slope, following what looked like a dry creek bed. After an hour, I found a spring. Clear, fast water bubbling over smooth rocks. I drank almost a liter, then filled up all my bottles. Then I followed the creek downhill. It led into a narrow ravine. Steep walls, thick trees. Hard to walk. I slipped again, landed in a thorn bush. My pants tore. My knee got cut open. I wrapped it with tape and kept limping forward. Just before sunset, I found something. A structure. It looked like a hunting shack or maybe a ranger hut. Old wood, cracked walls, a small door hanging half off the hinges. It was deep in the woods, no trail leading to it. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. Part of me felt relief, shelter, maybe help, maybe a map. Another part felt dread. It was too far out, too forgotten. But I had no choice. I pushed open the door. Inside, it was dark and smelled like old wood and rot. A cot sat in one corner, torn mattress, stained. A rusted stove, empty cans, a broken lantern, mice droppings everywhere. But the walls were what made me stop cold. They were covered in carvings, deep scratches in the wood, dates, names. Some were fresh, some faded. I walked closer. The last carved date was from just a few months ago. I stared at it. Someone had been here recently, but there was no sign of anyone now. I stayed there that night, locking the door from the inside with an old beam. I barely slept. Every sound made me flinch. I kept thinking about those carvings. How many people had gotten lost like me? How many never got out? The next morning, I followed the sun east again. My knee hurt, my shoulder throbbed, and I limped badly. I had been planning this solo hike for months. I'm not a professional hiker or anything like that, but I've been hiking long enough to know my way around trails and wilderness. I was 31 when I decided to do a 3-day hike through a less popular part of the Cascade Mountains in Washington. The trail wasn't exactly unknown, but it wasn't a hot tourist spot either. It had some steep climbs, some water crossings, and a handful of small clearings where people sometimes pitched their tents. The name of the trail doesn't matter. What matters is that I was alone, deep in the woods, far from any signal or help, and I made a few small mistakes that snowballed into a situation that could have killed me. I parked my truck at the gravel lot near the base of the trail around 7 a.m. on a Thursday in early September. The air was crisp, and I had checked the weather for the next 3 days. Nothing but cool mornings, clear skies, and calm nights. I packed food for 3.5 days, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, a foldable stove, extra batteries, 2 power banks, a physical map, a knife, and a small med kit. I was trying to keep it light but not irresponsible. The first day went smooth. I followed the winding trail up through switchbacks surrounded by tall pine trees and thick underbrush. My boots held up fine, no hot spots on my feet, no sweat pooling in my back. I took short breaks to eat jerky or trail mix, drank water from my filtered bottle, and kept a steady pace. Around 4 p.m., I reached a rocky ridge where I set up camp. From there, I could see a lake in the valley below, surrounded by forest on all sides. I boiled some water for a dehydrated meal, ate in silence, cleaned up, and went to bed as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The second day is where things slowly started to go wrong, even though I didn't notice it at the time. The first part of the trail that morning had me descending through a narrow canyon. It was shaded, damp, and filled with loose stones. I slipped once but caught myself. I was careful. I kept my pace slower through that stretch, but I still managed to tweak my right knee a little when I hopped down a ledge that was a bit taller than I thought. It wasn't a sharp pain, just a quick jolt, but it made me stop and test my leg. It held my weight fine, so I chalked it up to stiffness and kept moving. By midday, the terrain leveled out. I followed the trail through an open meadow and then into thicker woods. The trees were older here, taller, and the undergrowth thinned out. Felt more isolated, more untouched. I didn't see any other hikers. I didn't expect to, but it still made me realize how alone I was. I kept my phone on airplane mode to save battery, but I checked it just to see if a signal bar would pop up. Nothing. Late that afternoon, I reached a small creek that crossed the trail. I refilled my water, washed my face, and cooled my knee, which had started to ache a bit more. Still no swelling, but I knew I had to watch it. That night, I made camp in a hollow surrounded by tall trees. I couldn't see the stars through the canopy, but the wind was calm and the air was still. I sat with my back against a log and wrote a few lines in a notebook I always bring on hikes. Nothing deep, just what I'd seen, what I'd eaten, and how I was feeling. At that point, everything still felt manageable. I thought I'd finish the loop, get back to the truck by Saturday evening, and stop for a burger on the way home. I didn't know that the next 24 hours would push me into one of the most miserable and terrifying experiences of my life. On the morning of day 3, I woke up to a cold, wet feeling. I thought it had rained, but when I unzipped the tent, the ground was dry. My sleeping bag, though, had moisture on the foot end. That's when I saw the small tear in the base of my tent, probably from a twig or stone. Condensation had pooled there, soaking my gear. My socks were damp, one sleeve of my thermal was wet, and the foot of my sleeping bag felt cold and heavy. Still, it wasn't a deal breaker. I hung everything on a paracord line between 2 trees, let the sun do its thing, and boiled water for coffee. I waited about an hour before packing up and heading back on the trail. The trail that day was supposed to bend around a shallow ravine, then climb a ridge and loop westward. I double-checked my map before starting, and everything looked good. I kept walking until the trees thinned out and I saw the edge of the ravine. A drop maybe 40 feet deep and sloped, with loose rocks and patches of green. I scanned the other side and saw the trail continue up the ridge. But then I realized the wooden footbridge that was supposed to be there. Just a narrow beam over the small creek that ran at the base. was gone. I walked up and down the edge looking for it. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn, but the trail markers still matched the map. The bridge was just gone. Rot, storm damage, maybe someone had pulled it out. I don't know. What I do know is that I made a choice I now regret more than anything. Instead of turning around and rerouting, even if it meant backtracking half a day, I decided to go down into the ravine, cross the creek, and climb up the other side. It looked doable. I figured I'd shave hours off the hike and still be on track to finish the loop. I took it slow on the descent, testing each step. Loose soil, lots of tiny sliding rocks. I used a stick for balance and took small steps. My knee didn't like the steep angle, but it didn't give out either. Once I got to the bottom, I crossed the shallow creek. The water barely reached my ankles. I changed socks after crossing, dried my feet, and sat for a few minutes before starting the climb. The incline on the far side was steeper and rougher. No trail, no footing, just uneven ground and sharp, jagged rocks. I was about halfway up when my right foot slipped out from under me. I fell forward, caught myself with both hands, and felt a hot, stabbing pain shoot through my knee. Not a twinge, this was different. Deep, sharp, and immediate. I rolled onto my side, breathing fast, trying to stay calm. I didn't scream or cry, but I knew right then that I'd made a mistake. I tried to stand. My right leg buckled instantly. I could put zero weight on it without pain. Not just aching, white-hot pain like something tearing or being pinched. I sat down hard, leaned back against a tree, and took off my pack. My hands were shaking. My breathing was shallow. I unwrapped my ace bandage from the med kit and tried to wrap my knee tightly, hoping it was just a sprain. I stayed there for maybe 20 minutes, eating a protein bar and trying to think. There was no signal. I knew that. My phone was at 43% battery. No service meant no calling anyone. Even if I had a satellite phone, which I didn't, no one knew exactly where I was. I told a friend I was doing a loop trail and would check in Saturday night. That was my safety net. If I didn't show up or text by then, he'd alert someone. But it was only Friday afternoon. That meant at least 30 hours before anyone might notice I was missing, and maybe longer before a search started. And I was sitting there with one leg useless and no clear way back to the trail. I stayed there for almost an hour, thinking through every possible route. I considered crawling down the ravine again, following the creek until I reached the original trail, but I didn't know how far that would be. I also knew crawling would destroy my hands and arms and take forever. Eventually, I tried something in between. I broke off a thick stick and made a makeshift crutch, then started hobbling along the slope, trying to circle around toward the trail. It was slow, exhausting, and every few steps I had to stop to breathe. The terrain was unforgiving. I had to duck under branches, step over fallen logs, and move sideways along sloped ground while avoiding rocks that could roll under me. I probably covered half a mile in an hour, sweating through my shirt and gritting my teeth every time I had to shift weight. By evening, I hadn't found the trail. I set up camp in a clearing with uneven ground and barely enough room to pitch the tent. I was shaking from fatigue, and my knee had swollen to the size of a grapefruit. I had to drag my leg behind me when I moved. I didn't even eat. I drank water and lay down, knowing that sleep wouldn't come easy. That night was miserable. The pain kept me awake. My knee throbbed constantly, and every tiny shift sent a shock through my leg. I couldn't get comfortable. I kept thinking about animals, bears, cougars, even though I hadn't seen any. Every sound outside the tent made my heart race. A snapping twig, a rustling in the leaves. I gripped the knife under my pillow and lay still, waiting for morning. When the sun rose, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I checked my food. I had enough for maybe 2 more meals. My water was down to 1 full bottle. My phone was at 25%. I knew I couldn't just wait and hope to be found. I needed to move. That day, I tried to follow the rising sun, assuming that would take me east, back toward the parking lot. I used my stick to hobble, resting every 50 feet or so. I was starving, but I forced myself to save food for later. I ate a few almonds and sipped water. My throat was dry constantly. I stumbled across what looked like a game trail, a narrow path where deer or elk had passed through. I followed it, hoping it might intersect with the actual hiking trail. Hours passed. The sun moved overhead, then west. I felt dizzy and weak, and my knees started to feel hot, almost feverish. I've always liked being alone in the woods. Something about the silence, the stillness, the feeling of being far from everything fake. When I was younger, I'd go on weekend hikes through the smaller trails behind my neighborhood. As I got older, I started venturing out further. I'd go on longer hikes, tougher routes, ones that most people didn't want to try. That's how I ended up planning a solo multi-day hike through a backcountry route in the Bitterroot Mountains in Idaho. I'd read about this route online and in some old hiking forums. It wasn't a trail that was part of the main state-maintained network. It was one of those semi-abandoned logging trails that had once been used in the 70s and 80s, but nature had mostly taken it back. A few old-timers swore it was still passable if you had the gear and the guts to go deep enough. They mentioned old fire roads, collapsed bridges, overgrown switchbacks, steep ridges, and miles without cell signal. That was exactly the kind of challenge I was looking for. I spent weeks getting ready. I loaded up my pack with extra food, spare batteries, 2 GPS devices, one with offline maps, a printed map in case electronics failed, and backup chargers. I packed warm layers, waterproof gear, and even an emergency bivy sack. I made sure my boots were broken in and my socks were moisture wicking. I trained for it too, carrying a heavy pack on stairs, walking 10 miles every weekend with full gear. I thought I was prepared. The trailhead was about 2 hours away from any real town, down a gravel forest road that hadn't been maintained in years. I parked my car off a small clearing and locked everything up. I took one last look at my phone. No signal. I wasn't expecting one anyway. I shut it off to save battery, strapped on my pack, and started walking. The first few hours were easy. It was late September, and the weather was just starting to turn. The air was cool, crisp, and dry. The leaves were beginning to change, but the trail was still visible, even if it was overgrown in places. My map marked an old hunting cabin about 15 miles in that I planned to reach by nightfall. That would be my first stop. By late afternoon, the trail got harder to follow. Fallen logs blocked parts of it, and thick brush grew in strange spots, forcing me to detour several times. I had to check my compass and GPS every 20 minutes to make sure I hadn't veered too far off. But I kept pushing forward. I could feel my legs start to burn from the incline, and my shoulders ached under the weight of the pack. But I'd done worse before. I figured I was maybe 2 miles from the cabin when I saw something strange. There was a clean cut across the trail. Not like something fallen, this was an actual break. The dirt had collapsed inward, leaving a sharp drop. Erosion must have washed out part of the trail. On the other side was more trail clearly visible. It looked like I could get down and climb up again, but it would take some care. I took off my pack and lowered it down first, then carefully slid down the slope, digging my boots into the loose dirt. I got across and scrambled up the other side, using tree roots to pull myself. My hands got dirty, and one root snapped, making me drop a foot, but I caught myself. I didn't think much of it. That kind of stuff just came with backcountry hiking. I pushed on for another hour. I didn't see any signs of the cabin, but the sun was getting low. I stopped, checked the map again, and realized I had maybe miscalculated. Either I missed the turnoff for the cabin, or it had collapsed over the years. I had no choice but to camp where I was. I found a flat area beside a ridge and set up my small one-person tent. I cooked a quick meal with my camp stove and tried to enjoy the sounds of the woods as night came on. That first night, I didn't sleep well. Something about the silence was too heavy. I'm used to the normal sounds of a forest at night. Wind in the trees, animals moving, owls, things like that. But it was dead quiet. No wind, no bugs, just silence. My ears almost hurt from the stillness. It wasn't normal, but I told myself maybe it was the elevation, or maybe the cold had driven everything into hiding. I tried to sleep, and eventually I drifted off. In the morning, everything looked the same. Mist hung low over the trees, and the sky was pale and gray. I packed up and started hiking again. According to the map, I had to climb 2 steep ridges, pass a small dried-up stream, and follow the trail for another 8 miles to reach the next marker, an old fire lookout point. But about halfway through the hike, I started noticing something that didn't sit right. I saw a boot print in the dirt ahead of me. It wasn't mine. It was deeper, wider, and pointed slightly to the left. At first, I thought maybe it was an old print, but the dirt was soft from morning dew. That meant it was recent, maybe from this morning. That meant someone else was out here. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. No movement in the trees. I figured maybe a hunter was in the area, though I hadn't heard a single gunshot. I kept moving, but something in my gut told me to stay sharp. The print showed up again, then another. After a few miles, I stopped seeing them. I figured whoever it was must have taken a different trail or turned around. I kept going, trying not to let my mind spiral. But when I got to the lookout point, the wind started to pick up, and the air got colder fast. I looked for shelter nearby, nothing but trees and rocks. The lookout was gone, just the rusted bolts sticking out of the ground where the legs used to be. So I found a space between some boulders, set up camp again, and tried to settle in for the night. I boiled some water and ate. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, the air dropped to near freezing. I bundled into my bag and zipped it all the way up. I was about to fall asleep when I heard a crunch outside the tent. Not a branch falling, not wind, a footstep. One, then nothing, then another. Slow, spaced out. I stopped breathing for a second. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just listened. Another step, then silence, then something scraping lightly against the fabric of the tent. Just once, like a branch brushing it. But it wasn't wind. No gusts. The air was still. Then silence again. I stayed awake for hours. I never heard anything else that night. By morning, there were no prints, nothing out of place. Everything looked normal, but I knew what I'd heard. I didn't waste time packing up. I just got moving. I didn't want to spend another night out there. By mid-afternoon, I lost the trail. There were too many switchbacks. The terrain looked the same in every direction. My GPS stopped picking up my location, maybe from the tree cover or battery drainage. I tried to follow the compass and the map, but everything around me looked wrong. The trail I thought I was on faded out into overgrowth. I turned back, but couldn't find the last marker. I circled the same area for an hour, trying not to panic. I realized I had enough food for maybe 3 more days if I rationed carefully. Water wasn't a problem. My filter pump worked fine, and there were enough small streams around. But I knew I had to get my bearings. Around evening, I found an old sign. It was half-rotted and barely standing, tilted sideways with moss growing up the base. It had no writing left, just the faint shape of a painted arrow. I followed the direction it pointed, hoping it would lead to a logging road or a known marker. Instead, I found something worse. There was a campsite, but it wasn't new. The fire pit was cold, the logs blackened and old. A tarp had been tied between trees, faded and flapping slightly in the wind. Rusted cans littered the area. A boot was lying near the fire pit, one boot torn open at the toe. I called out instinctively, but of course no one answered. I checked the area, found a pack half covered by pine needles, ripped at the side. Inside were moldy food packets, a cracked metal water bottle, and a notebook. I opened the notebook, and the pages were water damaged, but a few words were still readable. Most of it was scribbled nonsense, but a few dates and words stood out. Day 3, still can't find trail back. Then later, Day 6 heard something last night. Then, Day 9 food's gone. Saw boot print. Not mine. My heart dropped. I didn't stay there long. I moved quickly, picked a direction, and pushed through the brush. I don't know how far I walked that night, but the moon came out and lit the forest in a pale blue color. My legs were shaking. My hands were raw from pushing branches aside. Eventually, I collapsed near a rocky slope and slept without a tent. I just wrapped myself in the bivy sack and tried to keep warm. Every sound made my eyes open, but the night passed and I was still alive. By the next day, I knew I had to drop weight. I ditched non-essentials, extra clothes, my stove, even my tent. I kept only food, water gear, and my emergency stuff. I had to move faster. I followed a stream downhill, thinking it might lead to a road or a trailhead. Hours passed, then another full day. I stopped only to drink and eat tiny bits. My feet were blistered, and my lips cracked from the dry wind. I found more prints once, 2 sets. Both looked fresher than mine, but again, I've always liked hiking alone. People say it's risky, but I've never been a stranger to nature. I don't take stupid risks. I bring enough food and water. I tell someone where I'm going. I track the weather. I carry my gear right, and I know how to read a map. Or at least I thought I did. What happened last summer changed how I look at all of it. Sometimes it doesn't matter how prepared you are. A single mistake can push you into something that you can't get out of easily. I was on a trip in British Columbia. I had taken a week off work and wanted to hike somewhere different. Somewhere quiet, off the beaten track. I did some research, found a trail not far from a logging road up in a less traveled area about 3 hours northeast of Kamloops. It wasn't even marked properly on Google Maps, just a rough line on a topographic site and a few pins from people who had been there once or twice. It seemed wild, clean, not overrun like the more popular hikes. That was the appeal. The trail was supposed to lead up to a long ridgeline, about 2,000 meters above sea level, with wide views on both sides. From up there, you could loop down through a scree pass and return through some wooded valleys. According to the info I had, it was a 24-kilometer loop if done right. That's what I planned for. I packed light but smart: tent, stove, water bladder, first aid kit, compass, Garmin GPS, printed maps in a Ziploc bag, food for 2 nights. I also had an emergency beacon. I wasn't planning on using it. I never had to before. I parked my car at a pullout on the side of the logging road early in the morning. The weather was perfect: clear skies, mild wind, no rain in the forecast for at least 48 hours. I crossed the ditch and entered the tree line, boots crunching through dry needles and leaves. The first section of the trail was faint but manageable. Old flagging tape tied to branches helped mark the way. There were animal tracks in the dirt, mostly deer and maybe a bear or 2. But that's normal. I kept moving, breathing slow, steady. I liked the silence out there, that deep, hollow quiet you only get in places no one's touched for a while. By mid-morning, I made it out of the trees and started climbing the slope that led toward the ridge. It was steep but stable, mostly packed dirt and stones. I followed the curve of the slope up to the crest and stopped for a while. The view was incredible. Valleys stretched out on either side, with narrow lakes catching the sunlight like broken mirrors. I sat down, ate some jerky, took a long drink, then got back up and followed the ridgeline south. That's when things started to shift. The ridge stretched out longer than I expected. The terrain didn't match what was on my map. I should have hit a fork and started descending within an hour, but the ground kept climbing slightly, winding left, then right, then narrowing until I was walking a knife-edge trail with drops on both sides. I pulled out my GPS. It had bars, but it showed me slightly off the marked trail. Just a few hundred meters. That didn't make sense. I hadn't taken any detours. I kept walking. Soon the ridge dipped and I saw a small plateau below, scattered with boulders and patchy grass. It looked like a good spot to rest. I found a slope on the left and descended slowly. When I reached the bottom, I checked the GPS again, and this time the map was loading slower than normal. The trail loop was gone. Just a gray screen with my blue location dot floating alone. That had never happened before. I tried rebooting it. Same thing. I pulled out my printed map. I had marked my expected path with red pen. According to my position and what I remembered from the terrain, I should have already turned back toward the woods on the east side by now. But there were no woods in sight. Just rock and scrubland to the south, the same narrow ridge I came from to the north, and a wall of cliffs to the west. It felt off. I stood there, squinting in the sunlight, heart beating a little faster than it should have. I decided to backtrack. Climbing back up the ridge was harder than coming down. I had to use my hands in some spots. Loose gravel made me slip more than once. When I got to the top again, I turned back the way I'd come and started walking fast. I was sweating hard now, not from heat but from something else. I kept looking behind me. I didn't know why. No one was there. I just didn't like the feeling of being watched, even though I knew it was all in my head. I walked for over an hour, but I never found the point where I'd originally come up. The trail was gone. The ridgeline had changed, same direction, same shape, but it felt unfamiliar, like I was walking a different version of it. The sun started to drop behind the peaks on the west. I knew I had to set up camp soon. I found a patch of level ground between two rock outcrops and pitched my tent. I ate a cold meal, drank half my remaining water, and laid back inside my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric roof. I didn't sleep much that night. Wind kept picking up, pushing the sides of the tent in and making sounds like footsteps in the grass. Every time I started to drift off, something snapped me awake. Once, I sat bolt upright, convinced I heard breathing outside, but there was nothing. In the morning, I packed up quickly and started moving again, trying to retrace everything, but the land had changed again. The ridge no longer dropped back the way I expected. Every slope I tried to descend either led to impassable cliffs or dense scrub that turned into steep ravines. I was losing elevation the wrong way. I knew I was drifting south, maybe even southwest. My map was useless now. The features didn't match anymore. I was in the same general area, but none of it lined up right. It was like trying to find a way out of a massive maze built from rock, trees, and time. By the afternoon, I ran out of water. My lips cracked. I was sweating less, which was a bad sign. Dehydration was creeping in. My muscles cramped when I climbed. Every step hurt. I tried saving energy, pacing myself. I figured I'd keep heading down and eventually hit a road or creek. Late in the day, I saw a dry creek bed and followed it. It wound between trees and boulders for a long time. Sometimes I had to climb over fallen logs. Other times I had to crawl under branches. I kept going. Around dusk, I finally found water, just a thin trickle running over stones, but enough to fill my bottle. I filtered it carefully, drank slowly, and tried not to puke. That night, I didn't set up the tent. I was too tired. I just laid my sleeping pad beside a fallen tree and stared up at the stars. They looked cold, too far away. My hands were shaking. My feet were blistered. I counted every breath like it was the only thing I still had control over. I must have passed out at some point. Next morning, I kept moving downhill. I didn't even know what I was looking for anymore. A sign, clearing, a structure, anything. The forest thickened.
Trisgot taller.
The ground softened underfoot. That was a good sign. It meant I was getting closer to lower elevation. I saw more birds too, heard them. That gave me some hope. But I also saw bear scat, fresh, and claw marks on bark. My heart dropped. I had no bear spray left. I'd used it weeks ago and hadn't replaced the can. I kept my knife on me, not that it would do much. I made noise by hitting my hiking poles together now and then. My head was pounding. My hands were swollen. My socks were soaked in blood from broken blisters. That day was the hardest. I slipped down a slope and landed hard on my left arm. I heard something crack. Could have been a sprain. Could have been worse. I screamed without sound, biting my lip until I tasted blood. My whole body pulsed with pain. I got up, cradling the arm, and walked slower. Every step was a grind, but I kept going. Near sunset, I saw something bright, metallic, small. I limped toward it, shaking, barely believing my eyes. It was a discarded beer can. Rusted, crushed, but human. Someone had been here. Not recently, but it meant I was near where people had been. I scanned the area and saw a faint depression in the ground. Not a trail, but maybe a path used long ago. I followed it. Within 2 hours, I saw the glint of a logging road. Real, white, graveled. I almost collapsed. My legs barely worked. I scrambled down the last slope and hit the road hard, scraping my knees. I didn't care. I laughed or cried, I couldn't tell which. I activated my emergency beacon and sat there, head on my knees, too drained to move. Rescue came 5 hours later. They found me half-conscious, covered in dirt, dehydrated, with a sprained arm and infected blisters. I spent 2 days in the hospital and another week resting at home. They told me I was lucky. that I'd gone too far off-grid, that the trail I was following probably hadn't been used in years, and that erosion and time had changed the landscape enough to make my maps useless. That happens more than people think, they said, especially in wild places with no official trail maintenance. I think about it a lot. I still hike, but I plan differently now. I trust less. I double-check everything. I carry I've been hiking for over 12 years, most of it solo. I know the rules and I know the risks, but something about this trip felt different even before I left. Not in some mystical way, just off. I had been planning it for months. A 3-day backcountry loop in Montana near the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness. Not a tourist trail, not a place with cell signal. Real remote. That was the whole point. It wasn't my first time in that area either. I'd done the lower part of the trail the year before and had been itching to do the full ridge circuit since then. This loop cut across the shoulder of several high peaks, most unnamed, and wrapped around an alpine basin that barely even showed up on satellite maps. The terrain was supposed to be rugged, steep ascents, sketchy drop-offs, long scree traverses. That's exactly what I wanted. I prepped hard, studied the route on topo maps for weeks, repacked my gear twice. I brought my Garmin InReach Mini, which lets me text via satellite if something really goes wrong. I told 2 people my route and when I'd be back. I even left a printed map in my truck at the trailhead in case someone had to come looking. I wasn't being stupid. It was the second morning that everything went wrong. The first day had gone fine. I hiked up the switchbacks out of the valley early, made camp beside a glacial lake around 4 p.m., filtered water, cooked a hot meal, and turned in just after dark. I slept light, like I usually do in the backcountry, but nothing happened. No animals, no weather, the kind of uneventful night I usually take for granted. I woke up early, packed up, and started the climb toward the ridge before 7 a.m. The trail faded pretty quickly once I hit the steep part. It was more of a goat path at that point. Lots of loose rock, narrow ledges, and long drop-offs. The wind had picked up overnight and hadn't settled. It wasn't dangerous, just cold and persistent. I threw on my shell and kept moving. The trail curved around a large shoulder of the mountain, then climbed steeply over a saddle and into a high basin I'd only seen on satellite imagery. It was breathtaking. Jagged granite walls on both sides, patches of snow clinging to shaded crevices even though it was mid-July. A pale, narrow stream ran through the middle, fed by meltwater. I stopped there to rest and drink some water. I didn't notice at the time that the trail had completely disappeared. I kept going, angling toward where I thought the trail would pick up again. The rocks underfoot were loose and sloped awkwardly. The basin was shaped like a bowl, so any misstep would mean sliding several hundred feet straight down, and probably off a ledge. Still, it didn't feel risky yet. I'd been in terrain like this before. I zigzagged my way toward the opposite side of the basin, hoping to intersect the path again. I didn't find it. What I did find, about an hour later, was a faint game trail heading straight up the side of the ridge. It wasn't what I had marked on my map, but it was going in the right direction. Up and over the ridge. That's where the loop continued. I figured this trail was probably just a shortcut or an animal path. Either way, it would get me where I needed to go. That was my mistake. The trail was sketchy almost immediately. Steep, narrow, eroded. I kept thinking it would level out or widen, that I'd see a cairn or some marker. I didn't. The higher I got, the worse it got. The wind picked up more the higher I climbed. I was already sweating under my jacket, even though it was freezing cold. Eventually, the trail turned into a scramble. Loose rock and gravel. Nothing to grip. Every step sent stones sliding down behind me. But by then I was committed. Going back down seemed more dangerous than going up. That's the trap. You get too deep into a bad decision and convince yourself forward is safer. I finally reached the top of the ridge just before noon. The view was unbelievable. Sharp ridges stretching in both directions, peaks behind peaks all the way to the horizon. But I was too tired to care. My legs were shaking. My throat was dry. My nerves were on edge. The wind up there was howling. No trees, no shelter, just loose rock and lichen. I pulled out my map again to try and figure out where the actual trail had gone. That's when I realized my mistake. I had climbed too far north, way too far. I had aimed for the wrong saddle and ended up on an unmarked ridgeline. The real trail was about 2 valleys over, and I'd have to go back down the way I came or try to find a new way across. I sat down behind a rock outcrop to block the wind and eat something. My hands were shaking as I opened the energy bar. I didn't feel right, not just tired, something else. I chalked it up to altitude and hunger. I forced myself to eat and sip water. That's when I heard it. Not an animal, not wind, something that didn't fit. A clatter of rocks behind me, farther down the slope, like someone had kicked a pile loose. I froze, waited. It didn't come again. I scanned the slope below me. Nothing, just boulders and scree and scattered patches of snow. I thought maybe it had just been a rock falling on its own. That happens all the time in the mountains. But the sound had felt close, sharp, not distant like a natural fall. I stood up and slowly scanned the ridge behind me, trying to see where I had come from. The whole slope looked like it could collapse if I touched the wrong part. I had a weird feeling in my stomach. Not fear exactly, more like alertness, like I wasn't alone. I told myself to ignore it and get moving. The ridge sloped downward on the far side. I figured I could descend into the next basin and maybe intersect the main trail again. I started following the ridgeline slowly, picking my way across loose rocks, one careful step at a time. I walked for maybe an hour, staying low and moving slow. The terrain got worse. The rocks were sharp and angular, like they'd broken off recently. Some parts tilted under my weight, others cracked. I nearly lost my footing twice. Once, I fell hard on my side and scraped my hip badly through my pants. I bled through the fabric, but I didn't want to stop. The second fall was worse. I stepped onto what looked like solid rock, and it gave way completely. I dropped onto my back and started sliding fast down the scree slope. My pack threw me off balance. I couldn't stop myself. My hiking poles went flying. I dug my boots in, but nothing slowed me. I slammed into a boulder and everything went black for a few seconds. When I came to, I was lying on my side, gasping. My shoulder throbbed. My ribs hurt. My leg was twisted under me weird. I didn't want to move at first. I just lay there breathing fast, trying to stay calm. Then I slowly started to check myself. I could move my toes, my fingers, my head, but my ankle was bad, swollen already. I couldn't put any weight on it. I had no idea how far I'd slid or where my poles had gone. My phone was in my chest pocket. Not broken, no service. My GPS tracker had flown off during the fall. I spotted it maybe 30 feet above me, wedged between 2 rocks. I had to crawl up to get it. Took forever. I was shaking, dizzy, and every movement hurt, but I got it back. That's when I realized how serious the situation was. I couldn't hike out like this. Not with the terrain this bad and my ankle like that. I had no idea how far off course I was now. Probably miles, maybe more. I looked around for somewhere flat to rest and regroup. There wasn't much, just jagged rock and slanted ledges. But I found a spot beneath a big outcrop where the ground leveled out just enough for me to sit and take off my pack. That's when I saw the boot print. It was maybe 10 feet from where I had fallen. Fresh, deep, not mine. It was pointed uphill toward where I had come from. My heart skipped. I stared at it for a long time. Then I looked around again. Nothing. No sound. No movement. Just wind. I felt the same tight feeling in my chest that I'd had earlier. Like I wasn't alone. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. No trail. No sign. No markers. And it wasn't just that the print was here. It was how fresh it was. The edges weren't eroded by wind. The heel was sharp. It looked like it had been made less than an hour ago. I tried to tell myself maybe it had been there before and I hadn't noticed, but I had fallen right past that spot. There was no way I wouldn't have seen it. I stayed there for an hour, not moving, trying to listen over the sound of the wind. At one point, I thought I heard a shuffle of rocks somewhere behind me. I turned fast. Nothing. Eventually, I wrapped my ankle as best I could with the compression bandage I carried, braced it with a tent stake and some tape, and started slowly making my way down the slope using one hiking pole I found. It was slow. Every step sent sharp pain through my leg. I gritted my teeth and kept going. I knew I wouldn't make it out that night. I needed shelter. I needed water. And I needed to get somewhere where I could send a message on my Garmin. By late afternoon, I found a patch of flat ground beside a large boulder field with a small spring trickling out beneath it. I made camp there, shivering. I filtered water. I was 31 when I decided to take some time off work and do a solo hiking trip through the northern section of the Cabinet Mountains in Montana. I've been planning it for a while. I was tired of screens, tired of sitting in the same room every day, and I needed to push myself again. I used to hike a lot in my 20s, but this would be my first long solo hike in years. I spent weeks getting the right gear, studying maps, checking satellite images, and watching weather patterns. I wasn't going to be reckless. I planned for about 6 days of hiking, carrying my own food, water purification gear, a tent, and all the safety stuff. I drove up early on a Saturday morning in July, parked my car near a ranger station, filled out the trail log, and started hiking. The weather was clear. My pack was heavy, but manageable. I had a Garmin satellite GPS and a detailed printed map in case batteries died. There weren't many people on the trail that day, just a few cars in the parking lot. The ranger station had been closed, but there were signs warning about bears, suggesting not to hike alone. I'd brought bear spray and made a habit of yelling occasionally to make noise. I knew the rules. The first 2 days went smoothly. I camped by a small lake the first night. The air was crisp and cool. Mosquitoes weren't too bad, and I saw deer moving through the trees at dawn. On the second day, I climbed up along a narrow ridge and saw the entire valley below stretch out for miles. There were parts of the trail that disappeared under fallen trees, but I always found my way again by checking the GPS and following terrain lines on the map. I moved slowly, carefully, taking my time. On the third day, I reached a fork I didn't expect. It wasn't marked on my map. There was a faint trail veering off to the right, with old cut marks on some of the branches that looked like someone had cleared it long ago. The main trail kept going left, along the side of the mountain. I hesitated for a long time. I checked the map again. That right path wasn't marked, but it looked like it descended into a valley that eventually curved back toward my intended loop. I figured it could be an old trail that had fallen off the official maps. Maybe it had once been a Forest Service path. It looked like it would shave a few hours off my hike. I took it. First, it was okay. A little overgrown, but I was used to moving through thick brush. I kept checking my GPS. The trail was sloping downhill through dense pine forest. After about an hour, I lost the path completely. The faint impressions of foot traffic had vanished. I was now moving through dense undergrowth, but my GPS still showed I was going in the right general direction. Then it stopped working. It didn't die. It just froze. The map wouldn't move no matter how far I walked. I tried restarting it. Nothing. I tried waiting. Still nothing. I opened it, pulled the batteries, put them back in. Nothing. It just showed my last known position with no updates. That's when I realized I might have made a mistake. I turned around, planning to backtrack and get back to the main trail. I couldn't find the path I'd taken down. I wandered in circles for about an hour. The forest all looked the same. Pine needles covered the ground, fallen branches everywhere. I tried to retrace my steps, looking for any familiar markers, but the trees were dense and there were no landmarks. I kept climbing uphill, thinking I'd eventually see the ridge line again. But the higher I climbed, the steeper it got. The light was starting to fade. That night, I camped on a slight slope, frustrated. I told myself I'd find my way back in the morning. I still had food, water, gear. I wasn't in danger yet, but I didn't sleep well. Every small sound outside my tent kept me up. At one point, I thought I heard something heavy moving through the trees, not close but far off. I laid there holding my bear spray. The next morning, I packed up early. I climbed further uphill for another hour. Eventually, I reached a rocky clearing and got a view of the area. It didn't look right. I saw no sign of the main trail. I didn't even see the ridge I thought I had descended from. In every direction, the trees looked endless. I tried using the compass and the sun's position to move northeast, where I thought the trail should have been. But the forest pulled me into its own shape. Down trees forced me one way, thickets of brush blocked other paths. I kept descending into the wrong valleys. Every time I thought I was climbing out toward a ridge, I'd get turned around. That evening, it rained. My tent kept me dry, but everything outside got soaked. My boots were wet the next day. My socks stayed damp no matter what I did. I started developing blisters. The pain slowed me down. I kept moving, but every step burned. I rationed my food carefully. I started boiling creek water. By the 5th day, I knew I was fully lost. My map was no longer useful. I didn't know where I was in relation to anything. I hadn't seen any other hikers since I left the main trail. No planes flew overhead. No cell signal. I started yelling sometimes, just in case someone was nearby. I blew my emergency whistle every hour or so. Nothing. That day, I heard the first strange sound. It was metal, like clanging, far away. I froze and listened. It echoed through the trees. I thought maybe it was a bell or someone hammering. I turned toward the direction it came from and hiked that way, hoping it was a sign of people. But after about an hour, I heard nothing more. I reached another dense stretch of woods. I sat on a rock and waited. No more sound came. That night, I didn't sleep again. The forest had gone quiet. No wind, no crickets, just silence. I thought about my family. I thought about the stupid choice I made taking that unmarked path. I thought about how far I might be from help. My feet were a mess. My legs ached. I was hungry all the time now. The 6th day, I followed a creek. I figured creeks lead to rivers and rivers lead to people. The flow was slow but steady. I moved downstream all day. I slipped a few times on wet rocks. One fall tore open my palm. Blood trickled into the water. I cleaned it as best I could. That night, I camped near the creek. My firewood was damp, but I got a small fire going. I dried my boots and socks as best I could. I heard something in the trees again. Heavy steps, then silence. By the 7th day, I was starting to lose it. I caught myself talking out loud. Not to anyone, just muttering. I cursed the forest, my decisions, the GPS. My food was almost gone. My body felt weak. I found some wild berries but didn't trust eating too many. Then I saw it. A fence. Just a single strand of rusted barbed wire nailed between two trees. Old and sagging. But it was man-made. I followed it. Curved downhill. After about 20 minutes, I saw a collapsed wooden structure. A cabin or a shed. The roof had caved in. No signs of life. But beside it was a rusted metal barrel, and near that, a trail. An actual trail. It was overgrown, but I could see the old cut logs lining the sides. The trail sloped downward. I followed it, limping. Every few minutes, I looked behind me. I couldn't explain why. I just felt watched. After 2 hours, I reached another structure. This one was standing. An old ranger station. The windows were broken, door hanging open. No one inside. But there were old papers pinned to a wall, maps from the 1990s, and most importantly, an old landline radio. It didn't work. The power was long dead. But I kept searching the building. In a closet, I found a plastic case labeled emergency beacon. The case was full of dust, but when I opened it, the beacon inside looked intact. It had a wind-up crank. I turned it for 15 minutes, then flipped it on. A red light blinked. I stayed there all night. I didn't sleep. I sat on the floor, staring at the radio, at the beacon. At one point, I heard something outside again. Not a person, just footsteps, slow pacing. I held my breath. They passed. In the morning, a helicopter came. It circled once, then dropped down nearby. I stumbled outside, waving both arms. 2 men came out and helped me aboard. I couldn't talk. I just sat there shaking. They gave me water. One of them told me I was lucky. I'd been missing for 8 days. My family had reported me overdue 3 days before. A search had begun the day before. The beacon saved me. I didn't say much during the ride. I just looked down at the forest below. So endless, so thick. I haven't gone hiking since. Not alone, not off trail. I still have the map I used. And sometimes, late at night, I take it out and look at the area where the unmarked trail was. It's still not on the map. And sometimes I wonder if it ever really was. I never thought I'd end up writing about this, but I guess when something changes you this much, it sort of sticks to your bones and never lets go. I've done solo hikes before, nothing insane, nothing deep into untouched terrain, but I've always loved being alone out in the wild. There's something about the silence, the fresh air, the way the trees move with the wind. For a long time, it gave me peace. After what happened, though, I haven't gone back out there, and I don't think I ever will. It happened in early fall, late September. I was 33 at the time. I had some saved up vacation days, and I decided to use them for a week-long solo hiking trip. My plan was to drive up to northern Montana, park at a trailhead near some Forest Service land, and hike a loop trail that was supposed to take about 5 days to finish. I'd mapped out everything. I had food, gear, backup maps, a GPS device, and a first aid kit. I wasn't careless. I was experienced enough to know what I was doing, or at least I thought I was. The first couple of days went fine. The trail was well marked, and I only ran into a few other hikers on the first day. After that, nothing but forest, mountain ridges, and long stretches of empty silence. I loved it. The mornings were cool and misty. The nights got cold, but I had a solid sleeping bag and an insulated tent. I kept a small fire when I could and stayed near water sources. Everything felt normal, good, even. By day 3, I'd covered over 20 miles. I remember waking up that morning to frost on the inside of the tent. My breath was thick in the air. I made some oatmeal, packed up my stuff, and checked the GPS. The plan was to cut across a narrow ridgeline that would lead to a valley with an old logging road. That road would eventually loop me back to where I started. According to my map, the ridgeline had a trail unmaintained, but still listed on the topo maps. I started heading up around mid-morning. The first part was steep with loose rock and narrow switchbacks. It wasn't easy, but I kept a steady pace. The higher I climbed, the more open the land became. I could see miles of forest behind me. I stopped once to take a drink and admire the view. I felt so far away from the world. No cars, no phone service, no people, just me and the trees. Around midday, I made it to the start of the ridgeline. The trail was there, but barely. Overgrown and narrow, with brush scraping my legs as I walked. It hugged the edge of the ridge in some places, with steep drop-offs just a few feet away. I slowed down. The last thing I wanted was to misstep. About an hour in, I noticed a weird shift in the wind. It had been blowing lightly from the west all morning, but now it just stopped. The trees stopped moving. Even the birds seemed to go quiet. I figured it might just be a lull, but something about it made the hairs on my neck rise. I kept walking, telling myself not to get paranoid. The trail got worse the further I went. Branches were down. In one section, a whole part of the ridge had collapsed and I had to bushwhack around it. I checked my GPS and saw I was still on the right path, just slow going. It was getting late in the afternoon, and I needed to find a flat spot to set up camp. I figured I'd push on for another hour, maybe find a clearing. That's when I noticed something off to the left of the trail. It looked like a torn piece of fabric. Blue. I walked closer and saw that it was part of a jacket sleeve, snagged on a branch. Faded, weather-worn. I looked around and saw more scattered items. An old boot, crushed and dirty, and what looked like a broken metal camping pot half buried in leaves. It wasn't recent. Everything was rusted and torn by time, but it didn't sit right with me. The stuff looked like it had just been left there, like someone had walked off trail and never came back. There weren't any signs or memorials like you sometimes see where people have died. Just broken things, scattered like breadcrumbs. I kept walking. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows. The air felt colder now. My gut started to knot up. I told myself again and again that I was just spooked by the abandoned gear, but the deeper I went, the heavier everything felt. Around 5 p.m., I found a small, flat spot with just enough room to set up my tent. It was tucked between some big rocks and a few scraggly trees. Not ideal, but better than nothing. I got camp set up quick. No fire, there wasn't enough dry wood around, and I didn't want to risk a blaze up on the ridge. I ate a cold dinner, trail mix and jerky, and crawled into my tent. The wind picked up again, but it was different this time. It came in sharp gusts that made the tent walls shake. I checked the stakes twice, made sure everything was tight. Then I lay there listening. Couldn't sleep, not for a while. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone or something standing just outside the tent. I kept hearing little snaps and cracks from the woods around me. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. Deer, small animals. But I couldn't relax. My heart kept thumping too hard. Eventually, I must have drifted off because I woke up hours later needing to pee. It was dark, really dark. The kind of black you only get in the backcountry. I unzipped the tent and stepped out with my flashlight. The air was freezing. My breath looked like smoke. I walked a few feet away from camp and did my business, then turned to head back. That's when I noticed it. There were tracks. Not animal tracks. Human, bare feet. I shined the light and saw them in the frost, clear as day, leading from the edge of the camp right up to the side of my tent, and then away again. They weren't mine. I wear boots, thick ones. These were naked feet, long toes, no tread, no socks, just feet. I stood there, frozen. I scanned the woods with my light, moving it side to side, my ears straining. Nothing, no movement, just trees and darkness. I backed into my tent and zipped it shut fast. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching my pocket knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't sleep either. The first light, I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted off that ridge. I checked the GPS again. The old logging road was about 6 miles ahead. If I could get to it, I'd be able to follow it for an easier hike back to my car over the next 2 days. The trail was worse than before. More deadfall, more overgrowth. My legs were getting scratched up, and my hands were raw from pushing branches out of the way. But I kept going. I didn't stop to rest, didn't stop to eat. I just walked. Sometime around noon, I started hearing something behind me. Not close, not loud, just a crack of a branch here and there. A rustle where there shouldn't have been one. I'd stop and listen. Silence. Then I'd walk again, and it would start up again after a few minutes. I started to think I was being followed. I turned around a few times, scanned with the binoculars I had clipped to my pack, but saw nothing. Still, I started taking random turns, off trail, then back on, trying to lose whatever might have been back there. I was sweating through my shirt even in the cold air. By late afternoon, I finally made it to the logging road. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Overgrown, deep tire ruts filled with old water, but it was wide and walkable. I stopped there for the first time all day, caught my breath, drank half my water, and forced down a granola bar. Then I saw it again. A print, in the mud, just to the side of the road. Barefoot, not fresh but not washed out either. I stared at it for a long time, then looked down the road, curved out of sight behind some trees. I didn't want to keep going that way, but it was the only way back. I walked fast, keeping my knife in my hand. The shadows were getting longer. I didn't want to be out there after dark again. I made it about 3 more miles before I found a spot to camp, just off the road, in a thick patch of trees. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't have much choice. My legs were shot. I set up fast. No fire again. I forced myself to eat something and drank the last of my water. Then I climbed into the tent and waited. That night was the longest of my life. I heard something moving just outside my tent. Slow footsteps, pauses, breathing. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tight my hand cramped. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. At one point, I heard a sniffing noise, like someone inhaling through their nose right near the fabric wall. Then it was gone. I stayed awake until the sun came up, shaking from cold and fear. When it was finally light enough, I tore down camp and got back on the road. I hiked all day, never stopping, never looking back. I didn't see more prints, didn't hear anything, but I didn't feel safe until I saw my car. When I got back to the trailhead, it was empty. No other cars, just mine, covered in dust and pine needles. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a long time, staring out at the trees. Eventually, I drove off. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station 2 hours away. I went in, bought a bottle of water, and used the bathroom. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the guy. I've hiked most of my life. It started as a weekend hobby when I was a teenager and eventually turned into a kind of ritual I did every few weeks to clear my head. Being outdoors, away from all the noise, always helped me think better. There was something comforting about the rhythm of walking through trees, the sound of my own breathing, and the feel of rough trail under my boots. But last fall, something happened during one of those hikes that changed how I look at the woods forever. I haven't told many people about it, not because I think they wouldn't believe me, but because I don't think they'd understand just how real and terrifying it felt to be completely alone and one mistake away from not coming back. It happened in October. I had taken a week off work to spend some time alone in the mountains. I chose a national forest about a 6-hour drive from where I lived. It was somewhere I'd only been once before, and I remembered the trails being long, quiet, and a little rugged, which is exactly what I wanted. No touristy overlooks or short loops filled with joggers and families. I wanted miles of wilderness where I could walk, breathe, and sleep under the stars. I planned a 4-day solo hike through an old trail called Ridge Trail. It wasn't officially maintained anymore, but I'd found some recent trip reports online from people who'd hiked it. From what I read, it was around 38 miles long, snaking through thick woods, overgrown ridges, and a few dry creeks. The reports all said the same thing: it was quiet, beautiful, and rarely traveled. That's what sold me. I printed out a topographic map, marked out water sources, packed 5 days of food, and threw everything in my old 65-liter pack. The morning I started the hike, the air was cool and dry. I parked my car at a small gravel turnout near the old ranger station, locked up my gear, and started walking. The first few miles were easy. The trail was overgrown but visible, lined with dry leaves and fallen branches. I could hear birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels jumping between trees. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was no sign of other people, no voices, no footprints, just the sound of the forest and the weight of my pack pressing down on my shoulders. By the end of the first day, I had made it around 9 miles in. I camped on a flat section beside a dry creek bed, cooked some pasta over my small stove, and watched the sun set through the trees. That night was uneventful. Just the usual forest noises, wind pushing through leaves, the sharp chirp of insects, and an occasional owl. The next day, the trail started to get harder. It climbed higher into the ridge and the path narrowed. I had to stop a few times to pull thorns from my pants and step around fallen trees. I still hadn't seen another person, not even an old fire ring or fresh tracks. It didn't bother me. I'd hiked alone plenty of times before, and being alone in the woods wasn't new to me. But I did notice that the deeper I went, the quieter it got. Not just fewer people, but fewer animal sounds too. No birds, no bugs. Just the wind and my own footsteps. Around noon that day, something strange happened. I was coming down a small slope when I saw something in the dirt, what looked like a boot print. At first, I figured it was mine from the day before, but it wasn't. The tread was different. I crouched down and studied it. It looked fresh, maybe a day old at most. A single print facing uphill like someone had walked this way. I stood up and looked around. No sign of anyone. No broken branches. No movement. Just that one print in the dry dirt. I told myself someone probably passed through and turned back. Or maybe it was older than I thought. But as I kept hiking, I started seeing more prints. Not many, just one here and there, spaced out like someone had been walking slowly, maybe stopping a lot. I couldn't figure out why that unsettled me so much. People hike all the time, but there was something about how quiet the trail was and how far out I already was. It just felt wrong to be seeing fresh prints with no sign of a person. I pushed the thought aside and kept moving. That night, I made camp a few miles farther along the ridge. I found a narrow clearing tucked between some boulders and trees. The ground was soft and sloped just enough to keep water from pooling. I set up my small tent, ate some dried fruit and jerky, and lay back inside with my flashlight. I kept thinking about those prints. Something about them kept nagging at me. Not just the fact that they were there, but how far apart they were spaced. Like the person wasn't walking normally, maybe limping, maybe stopping. I don't know. I eventually fell asleep, but I kept waking up. At one point, I thought I heard a sound, like something moving through dry leaves, but when I sat up and listened, it was gone. The third day was the hardest. The trail followed a narrow ridge with steep drop-offs on both sides. I had to move slowly, checking every step. A fall in the wrong place and I wouldn't be getting back up. I stopped around midday to rest and refill water from a small spring I'd marked on my map. While I was filtering the water, I looked up and froze. Up the trail, maybe 50 yards away, there was movement. I couldn't make out what it was, just a flicker of something light-colored moving between trees. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. The trees swayed gently. The forest was still. I told myself it was probably a deer or a coyote, but I packed up fast and kept moving. That night, I made camp in a spot that felt more exposed than I liked, but it was the only flat ground for a mile in either direction. I didn't even cook. I ate a granola bar and climbed into my tent as the sun dipped below the ridge. I lay there in the dark, listening. At one point, I heard a soft thump outside, like a rock dropping onto dirt. I sat up, holding my breath. Nothing. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next morning was when things started to unravel. I woke up just after sunrise, groggy and cold. When I unzipped the tent, I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were boot prints around my tent. Not mine. The same pattern I'd seen on the trail. They circled the tent once, then disappeared off into the brush. I stood there in silence, my breath steaming in the morning air. I scanned the woods but saw nothing. No movement.
No sounds.
Just prints. I packed up fast. I didn't even eat. I threw everything into my bag and started walking. I didn't care about finishing the loop anymore. I just wanted to get back to my car. I checked my map and planned a shorter exit using an old connector trail that would shave off about 8 miles. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. As I moved, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every little sound made me flinch. At one point, I thought I heard a cough in the distance. Just once. Short and dry. I stopped and listened, heart pounding. Nothing followed. Just wind. I made it about 10 miles that day. I kept expecting to see someone, anyone, but the trail stayed empty. When I stopped to rest, I didn't sit for long. I barely ate. I just wanted to keep moving. That night, I didn't pitch my tent. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag and lay beneath a cluster of fir trees. I didn't sleep much. I kept my headlamp in one hand and my knife in the other, even though I knew it wouldn't do much. I kept imagining someone creeping up while I slept. I don't think I slept more than an hour or two. The final morning, I was exhausted but alert. My pack felt twice as heavy. I moved fast, even though my legs burned with every step. I was maybe 3 miles from the trailhead when I saw it. Something hanging from a low branch. It was a strip of cloth, faded and torn, like it had been ripped from a shirt or jacket. I didn't stop to study it. I just kept going faster now. When I finally saw the roof of the old ranger station through the trees, I almost cried. I pushed through the last stretch of brush and stumbled into the gravel lot. My car was still there, dusty and undisturbed. I tossed my pack into the back, locked the doors, and sat behind the wheel for a long time before I even started the engine. I looked back toward the trail. Nothing but trees and silence. I drove straight home that day. Didn't stop for food. Didn't stop for gas until I absolutely had to. When I got back to my apartment, I unpacked everything and stored my gear in the closet. I didn't go hiking again for months. To this day, I still don't know who was out there. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, but someone followed me. Someone walked around my tent in the middle of the night. Someone was watching from the trees. And the worst part is, I don't know why. They didn't steal anything, didn't try to hurt me. They just stayed back, always out of sight, always just close enough to let me know I wasn't alone. I filed a report with the local ranger office the week after I got back. The guy I spoke to sounded concerned but didn't say much. He said they'd check the trail for signs of trespassers or camps. I never heard back. Now, I still hike, but I don't go alone anymore. And I never take the same trail twice. I've learned that the woods don't have to be haunted for them to be terrifying. Sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't a ghost or a monster. Sometimes it's just a stranger in the trees, following silently, step by step. I never used to think hiking alone was a bad idea. I actually liked it better that way. I liked not having to wait for someone to catch up or slow down. I liked the silence, the way your thoughts get louder when you're not talking. I've been hiking on and off for almost 7 years. Nothing serious, just local trails near where I lived in northern Colorado. Sometimes I'd spend a few days out if I had the time off, but most of my hikes were single-day trips. I'd usually start early, pack light, stick to marked trails, and be back before dark. This time I tried something different. I decided to hike a lesser-used trail about 2 hours from my town, somewhere near the Roosevelt National Forest. I picked it because I'd read online that it was quiet, scenic, and not too crowded, even on weekends. I had Friday off, so I thought I'd avoid the weekend crowd altogether. The place was called Cutoff Ridge Trail. I'd never heard of it before. The name caught my attention, but I didn't think much of it. The plan was simple. Drive up early, hike the full loop, about 12 miles, and drive back by evening. I packed 2 big bottles of water, a basic first aid kit, a sandwich, a protein bar, and a knife I always carry when I'm in the woods. I also brought my headlamp just in case. The weather forecast said clear skies with mild temperatures, perfect hiking weather. I left home at around 6:30 in the morning, reached the parking lot at about 8:45, and started the hike close to 9. The lot was empty except for one old pickup truck. There wasn't a visitor booth, just a wooden trail sign and a hand-drawn map posted beside it. I snapped a photo of the map with my phone just in case. There was no cell service the moment I left the highway. The first few miles were uneventful. The air smelled of pine and earth. It was quiet, almost too quiet. There weren't many birds chirping like you'd expect. Just the occasional sound of wind pushing through the trees or the crunch of my boots on dry soil. The trail was narrow but easy to follow. Dirt packed down from past hikers, weaving through the trees and across a few open clearings. About 3 miles in, I noticed something odd. There was a section of trail where the packed dirt started to fade, like no one had walked through it in a long time. The trees got thicker. Felt like the trail had split, but there were no signs marking it. I pulled out the photo of the map, but it was too rough to tell if this was an official split or not. I assumed it was the loop turning back toward the parking lot, so I followed it. The farther I walked, the quieter everything got. I mean, it was already pretty silent before, but now it felt like everything was holding its breath. No wind, no animals. I couldn't even hear bugs. I kept walking because the trail was still visible, just faint. I told myself it was just an overgrown part of the loop that didn't see much foot traffic. Around noon, I stopped in a small clearing to eat. There was a big rock near a fallen log, and I sat down to rest. I drank some water, ate half my sandwich, and stretched a bit. Everything felt normal. I figured I was more than halfway done. After about 15 minutes, I got up and kept walking. This next stretch of trail got weird fast. It dipped down into a gully that felt much darker than the rest of the forest. The trees hung low, and the path narrowed even more. The ground was damp, almost muddy in places. I kept slipping on patches of wet leaves and had to use trees for balance. At some point, I looked up and realized the trail was gone. Just like that, it wasn't there anymore. No faint path, no broken branches, no trampled dirt. Just thick underbrush and tall trees. I turned around, trying to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. I started walking back the way I thought I came, but after 10 minutes I was still in the same spot. The trees all looked the same, straight trunks, dark bark, no markings. I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time on the trail. Panic. I told myself to stay calm, to backtrack more carefully, but the more I walked, the more I felt like I was just going in circles. I pulled out my phone. Still no signal. I turned on my GPS app anyway, thinking maybe it could give me a direction. Nothing loaded. It just spun, searching for satellites. By then it was almost 2 p.m., and I knew I had to figure things out quickly. I sat down, forced myself to finish the rest of my sandwich, and planned out what to do. I remembered that most trails run in loops or eventually connect to roads or clearings. I decided to walk in a straight line, hoping I'd hit a path or road eventually. That was easier said than done. The forest here was thick. Every few feet I had to duck under branches, push past shrubs, or climb over rocks. I couldn't keep a perfectly straight line, but I did my best. An hour passed, then two. Still nothing. At one point, I thought I heard running water. I headed toward it, thinking maybe it was a creek. If I found water, I could follow it downstream. It usually leads to roads or campsites, but it wasn't water. It was just wind moving through the branches in a way that sounded like it. By now, the sun was starting to dip. The light was turning yellow, and the shadows were growing longer. I checked my watch. 6:03 p.m. I needed to set up camp, even if I didn't have one. I found a flat patch of ground between some large trees and cleared away the loose sticks and pine cones. I didn't have a tent or sleeping bag, just a light emergency tarp and a thin thermal blanket. I wrapped myself in the blanket, lay on top of the tarp, and tried to get some rest. That night was cold and long. I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up and look around. I heard rustling in the bushes several times. Probably animals, but in the dark, it all feels like something worse. At one point, something sniffed near my foot. I didn't move, just lay there frozen, breathing shallow, until it wandered off. The moment the sky turned gray, I got up. My body was stiff, my legs sore. I ate the protein bar I had left, drank some water, and kept moving. The second day, I followed the sun, trying to move in one general direction. The forest kept changing, some parts thick, some open, some swampy, some rocky. It was like the terrain couldn't make up its mind. Around midday, I found an old fence post, just one. No fence, no trail, just a half-rotted wooden post sticking up out of the ground. It was a good sign. Man-made stuff means people were once around. I headed in that direction and found more posts, maybe 200 feet apart. Some had wire still attached, most didn't. They led me up a slope, and near the top, I saw what looked like a dirt road. I nearly cried. I climbed up, and sure enough, it was a real road, rocky, uneven, and clearly not used much, but definitely made by vehicles at some point. I followed it for hours. My feet were blistered, my back hurt, but I didn't care. Just before sunset, I saw something I hadn't seen in 2 days. A sign. A faded, rusted metal sign half buried in tall grass that said, Service Road 9C. I had no idea where that was, but it meant I was somewhere mapped. I kept walking. An hour later, headlights. A beat-up blue SUV came around the bend. I waved both arms, standing in the middle of the road. The driver slowed down and rolled down the window. He looked at me like I was a ghost. I didn't even explain. I just asked if he could take me to the nearest ranger station or gas station with a phone. He nodded and unlocked the door. I got in and slumped against the seat. I hadn't realized how bad I smelled until I sat in a closed car. He drove me about 30 minutes to a small gas station with a payphone. I called a friend to come get me. Turns out I was about 40 miles from the trailhead where I'd parked. My car was still there, so was the old pickup truck. I told a ranger what had happened, where I thought I went, and how the trail just vanished. He said it happens more than people realize. One wrong turn, one faint path, and you're somewhere completely off course. He asked if I saw any signs or markers. I said no, just trees and silence. I haven't hiked alone since then. I still think about that trail sometimes, Cut-Off Ridge. The name makes more sense to me now. Maybe it wasn't a loop at all. Maybe that path I followed was never a trail to begin with. Or maybe it was once before people stopped using it and the forest took it back. Either way, I got lucky. I had just enough food, just enough water, and just enough light to make it out. If I hadn't found that fence post, if I hadn't kept moving, If I twisted my ankle or gotten sick or panicked, that could have been it. People think the forest is peaceful. Sometimes it is, but it doesn't care about you. It's not evil, but it's not kind either. It's just there. You step off the line, and it swallows you like you were never there. I haven't stopped hiking, but I don't go alone anymore, and I never trust a trail just because someone marked it on a map. I'd done plenty before. Some people liked gyms. I liked mountains. I liked the silence, the rhythm of footsteps on trail, the smell of dirt and pine. Being out there with just a backpack and my own 2 legs helped clear my head better than anything else ever could. That weekend, I planned on doing a loop through a less popular trail system in the northwestern part of the state. It wasn't too far from the border, and it sat on the edge of an old state forest. I'd found it on a paper map tucked away in my old hiking box, a loop that was marked but had no reviews online and wasn't even mentioned on the hiking forums I usually scanned. That only made it more interesting to me. I figured it would be quiet. No crowds, just me and the woods. I left my car at a small gravel pull-off on a Saturday morning around 8 a.m. The air was cool and damp, with patches of fog still hanging around the treetops. I loaded my pack, double-checked the paper map, locked my car, and started walking. The trail started off as a clear dirt path through tall trees. I passed some old stone ruins after about half an hour, probably a foundation from a logging camp or homestead. The trail was marked with faded orange paint on the trees, spaced out every 50 feet or so. It wasn't hard to follow, but it was clearly less traveled. Some parts were overgrown. A couple downed trees crossed the path, and I had to crawl over or around them. By the afternoon, I was well into the forest. I hadn't seen a single person all day. I cooked a simple lunch on my camp stove near a creek and filtered some water. I was feeling great, energized. The trail cut through a deep gully in the forest, and I had to scramble down into it and up the other side. Around 4 p.m., I reached a small ridgeline where I decided to camp. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows between the trees. I set up my tent, hung my food bag high in a tree, and sat on a log while I ate dinner from a pouch. Everything felt quiet, peaceful. I read my map again, planning to complete the loop by late the next afternoon. The whole hike was supposed to be about 22 miles. I had already done about 10. I went to bed early that night. I was asleep before 9, but I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I didn't know what time it was, but it was pitch black. No moon, no stars. My watch was tucked deep in my pack. I had this strange feeling in my gut, like something had changed, not something outside. More like something in me was different. I laid still and listened. No sounds, not even wind, not an owl. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears. Eventually, I fell back asleep. I got up at first light, packed everything, and hit the trail again. But something felt off. I kept thinking I was hearing faint noises ahead of me. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I paused and listened, it was quiet. I started to wonder if there was a bear nearby, maybe even a cougar. I kept going, but I was more alert. The woods didn't feel as peaceful as the day before. The trail dipped and climbed through dense forest. I checked the map often. I didn't want to get turned around. Around midday, the trail narrowed and passed through an area that was much more overgrown. The trees were younger, thinner. Everything looked the same in every direction. I followed the orange blazes, but they were faded, hard to spot. At one point, I came to a fork. There was no marking, no blaze. The trail split and both paths looked equally worn. I pulled out the map and compass. It looked like I should veer left to follow the loop, so I did. I walked for another hour before I noticed something was really wrong. The trees weren't marked anymore. I hadn't seen a blaze in over half a mile. I stopped and retraced my steps. Nothing. The trail had narrowed so much it didn't even feel like a trail anymore. I pulled out the map again, tried to match the terrain, but everything looked the same. There were no landmarks, no ridges, no creeks, just trees and trees and trees. That feeling in my gut returned. I felt like I was being watched. I turned around and looked behind me. Nothing. I walked another 100 feet. Still nothing. But I couldn't shake it. I started to move faster. My heart picked up. I kept checking over my shoulder. Still nothing. No sounds, just my footsteps and my breathing. I stopped to take a drink of water, but I noticed my hands were shaking. I kept walking, hoping to reconnect with the main trail. But by 4 p.m., I knew I was lost. Completely. I wasn't panicking yet, but I was close. I hadn't seen a blaze in hours. The sun was starting to dip, and the trees were blocking most of the light. I decided I needed to set up camp early and try again in the morning with a clearer head. That night was worse than the one before. Couldn't sleep. Every little sound made my skin crawl. I kept thinking I was hearing footsteps. Crunching. Slow, soft, but there. But when I peeked out of my tent with my headlamp, I saw nothing. Just trees. My mouth was dry. I barely ate. I kept thinking something was circling me out there. A bear. Person. I didn't know. I didn't even sleep for more than 20 minutes at a time. I kept jerking awake, heart pounding. The first light, I packed up again. I decided to go back the way I came. I thought if I followed my footprints, or at least went back to that last fork, I could find my way to the trail again. But the forest had changed. It looked different. I went the way I thought I had come, but after a mile, I realized I had no idea where I was. There were no trails anymore, no blazes, just forest. I screamed into the trees. Not words, just a sound. I was angry, scared. I smacked a tree with a stick. I cursed. I cried. Then I kept walking. That afternoon, I found an old path. It was barely visible like a game trail, but it seemed like something. I followed it for hours. It kept winding through thicker brush, up and down small hills, through mud and over roots. I stumbled a few times. My legs were burning. I ate jerky and trail mix while I walked. I didn't stop. I was afraid to stop. Just before dark, I came upon something that made me freeze. It was a boot, just one. A hiking boot, half buried in mud off to the side of the trail. It was old but not ancient. Still had laces, covered in moss. I didn't know what to do. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it. Why was it there? Did someone else get lost here too? That night, I didn't set up my tent. I found a small cluster of rocks and sat with my back to one of them, wrapped in my sleeping bag. I kept my headlamp off to save battery. I held my knife in my hand, even though I knew it wouldn't help much. I barely slept. The next morning, my throat was raw and my stomach ached. I was almost out of food. I started walking again. My legs felt like concrete. My socks were wet and my boots rubbed raw spots on my ankles. Around midday, I saw something up ahead, something man-made. It was a signpost, just a wooden post, nailed to a tree, with the word service carved into it. The arrow pointed right. I didn't know what it meant, but I followed it. After about 30 minutes, I saw more signs. Broken boards, wood planks, what looked like pieces of a fence. I kept moving. Then I heard something. A motor. I ran. I didn't care about my legs or lungs or anything else. I crashed through the undergrowth, following the noise. And then I saw it. A dirt road and a pickup truck. I stumbled out onto the road, waving my arms. The truck screeched to a halt. It was a Forest Service vehicle. Collapsed. I could barely speak. They gave me water, called for help, took me back to a ranger station. I had been missing for 3 days. They said that trail loop hadn't been maintained in almost 15 years. The map I used was outdated. A fire had destroyed part of the forest over a decade ago, and the trails had all been rerouted or abandoned. The section I had wandered into wasn't even public land anymore. It was a no-go zone due to erosion and wildlife protection. No one ever hiked there. No one even patrolled it. I asked about the boot I saw. They didn't have an answer. I recovered, slowly. Physically, I was fine after a week. But mentally, I was different. The woods didn't feel the same. I haven't gone hiking since. I still love nature, but not like before. Not alone. Not miles deep where no one knows where you are. The scariest part wasn't being lost. It was knowing how easy it was to disappear. How quiet the forest can be. How it can swallow you whole and never make a sound. I've always enjoyed hiking, not the Instagram hiking kind, where you're out there snapping photos of waterfalls and picnic spreads. I mean real hiking, grueling, quiet, sometimes boring, sometimes punishing. The kind that makes your legs sore and your back ache and your thoughts loud. There's something about being far away from everything, where your phone doesn't work and every sound makes you look over your shoulder. It's peaceful and terrifying at the same time. This happened in the fall of 2021. I was 31 years old, living in Idaho, and trying to take some time off from a messy breakup and a burnout I didn't want to admit. I had 3 weeks off from work and didn't want to spend them inside doom scrolling or drinking myself into a stupor. I wanted something that would hurt a little, something real. There's a long-distance trail out here called the Selkirk Crest Traverse. It's not as famous as the PCT or the AT, but it's brutal in its own way. The terrain is unforgiving. Dense forest, loose rock ridges, steep elevation gains, and it's not very well marked. The whole thing stretches close to 80 miles, and some sections don't even have proper trail maintenance. If anything happens to you out there, you're basically on your own. I liked that idea more than I should have. I had done parts of it before, but never all in one go. This time, I decided to do the entire trail solo from south to north. I had mapped everything out on paper and GPS. I packed freeze-dried food for 10 days, a small stove, 2 water filters, my tent, and enough warm clothes to survive some mountain nights that easily dropped into the 20s. My plan was simple. Start at the southern trailhead near Priest River and work my way up to the northern terminus near the Canadian border. I figured I could do it in 8 days if I pushed hard. The first 3 days went almost too well. The trail was rough, but I expected that. I camped near creeks, kept my gear dry, and didn't see a single person. The solitude was exactly what I needed. I saw elk one morning, a black bear from a distance, and a dozen chipmunks who seemed convinced I had snacks for them. But on day 4, things started to get weird. That morning, the fog rolled in thick and low. I had climbed about 2,000 feet since sunrise and found myself on a narrow ridge called Razorback. It's a spine-thin formation where the trail straddles a sharp drop on both sides. Normally, with a clear sky, the view is stunning. You can see the layers of ridges unfolding below like waves. But that morning, all I saw was white fog, dense enough that I could barely see my own boots. I kept going, moving slowly. I had my trekking poles out, feeling the trail ahead of me because I couldn't risk a wrong step. My GPS was glitchy, jumping my position around. I stopped every 5 minutes to recalibrate. I should have waited the fog out, but I didn't want to fall behind schedule. That was mistake number 1. About an hour into the fog, I noticed the trail starting to drop on one side more than the other. I followed it, assuming I had crossed Razorback and was now descending toward the next valley. The terrain got rougher, rocky, loose, not very trail-like. I told myself it was just an unmaintained section. Happens all the time. Then I came to a clearing, a wide slope of boulders and scree. The fog had lifted just enough for me to realize I was nowhere near where I should have been. I was standing at the edge of what looked like an old landslide. Trees snapped like matchsticks, boulders the size of vans scattered across the slope. I checked my map. Nothing like this was marked. I was off trail. That's when the wind picked up, cold, sharp, cut through my jacket and made the trees groan like old ships. I looked around, trying to backtrack, but every direction looked the same in the thinning fog. I turned on my GPS again, still glitching. I decided to climb a bit higher to get my bearings. From the top of the slope, I finally saw it. The trail was a good 300 feet to my left, just barely visible through the trees. I must have veered off during the fog and curved away without realizing it. I cursed myself under my breath, made a note to be more careful, and started bushwhacking my way back. That's when I heard it. A low, heavy thump, not like a tree branch falling, more like something big landing nearby. I froze. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence afterward. Could have been a bear, or a moose, or a rockfall. I waited a minute, then moved slowly, eyes scanning everything around me. No movement, no sounds. When I finally reached the trail again, I felt stupid for getting spooked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't fear. It was more like being watched. I kept moving, That night, I made camp in a small bowl-shaped valley with a shallow creek running through it. I set up my tent on a patch of dry moss, filtered water, ate a hot meal, and sat quietly until dark. I kept listening for sounds, branches, footsteps, anything, but the woods were quiet. Too quiet, maybe. I didn't sleep well. I woke up several times, convinced I had heard breathing outside the tent. Not footsteps, not animals. Breathing, slow, shaky, like someone standing just outside, trying not to be noticed. But every time I unzipped the tent and looked, there was nothing there, just dark trees and wind. By sunrise, I was exhausted. I packed up quickly, didn't eat breakfast, and started hiking before my legs were even warmed up. About 5 miles in, I came across something that stopped me cold. A boot, just one, lying in the middle of the trail, dirty, old, and scuffed. Not torn apart like an animal had dragged it. Just there, upright. No blood, no sign of a person. The laces were still tied. I looked around, called out. Nothing. I picked up the boot. Size 10 maybe. Worn leather. The heel was cracked. It didn't look like it had been sitting there for very long. The sole wasn't even wet from the dew. It felt like someone had just left it there. I set it down on the side of the trail and kept walking, but now every little sound made me flinch. Another hour in, I started seeing broken branches at shoulder height. Not snapped naturally from snow load, these looked yanked down. Some were twisted, and there were scrape marks on the tree trunks nearby. Not deep gouges, just long, thin scrapes like something was dragging across the bark. No claw marks, just strange. I told myself it was probably deer antlers, or maybe someone's walking stick. But they looked off. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I camped in a thicket of pine, tucked against a small granite wall. I didn't build a fire. I didn't cook. I just ate a protein bar and sat inside my tent with my headlamp off, listening. Every so often, I heard something move in the brush, a single crack of a branch, then silence. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, breathing, closer this time. I held my knife in one hand and bear spray in the other. I didn't dare move. Then I heard footsteps, slow, one at a time. Crunch, pause, crunch. They stopped just outside my tent. I don't know how long I stayed frozen like that. 10 minutes? An hour? I never unzipped the flap. I didn't even blink. I just waited. Eventually, the steps moved away. I didn't hear anything after that. At first light, I packed up and hiked without eating. I decided I'd cut the trip short and head for the nearest exit point. A service road marked about 8 miles ahead. I was done. Whatever was out there, animal, person, whatever, I didn't want to find out. But it didn't let me leave. I never found the road. The trail markers disappeared. I followed the GPS, but the terrain didn't match the topography. Hills were where they shouldn't be. Creeks flowed the wrong way. It didn't make sense. I started seeing things again. Another boot, a torn jacket sleeve, an empty metal water bottle with dents in it, all abandoned in strange spots, and more of those broken branches. Around midday, it started to rain. Cold, hard. I was soaked in minutes, slipping on the muddy trail, trying to keep my bearings. My maps were soggy, and my phone had already died. That's when I slipped. I was crossing a wet log over a narrow gully and lost my footing. I fell hard, rolled down the slope and hit my shoulder on a rock. I heard a pop. Pain shot down my arm. I couldn't move it after that. My right arm was useless. I couldn't climb back up. I couldn't find the trail again. I started to panic. I yelled for help. No answer. I spent the night under a tree root overhang, shaking from the cold and pain. I had wrapped my arm in a spare shirt and tied it against my chest with my belt. No footsteps that night. No breathing. Just wind. The next morning, I knew I had to get out, injured or not. I followed the slope downward, hoping to find a creek and follow it downstream. I walked for hours, slipping, falling, sometimes crawling. My legs were cut, my clothes soaked and filthy. That's when I saw the cabin. It was old, maybe abandoned, half collapsed on one side. No trail leading to it. just sitting there between the trees like it had grown out of the dirt. The I decided to go on a solo hiking trip late last September. I had some time off from work, and the weather was just starting to cool down. Not too hot during the day, not too cold at night. I wanted to get away from people for a while, spend some time in nature, clear my head. I'd been hiking for years and felt confident in the outdoors. I'd never had a problem before. I usually stuck to trails in state parks or national forests, but this time I picked something a little more remote. A loop trail deep in the Bitterroot Mountains of western Montana. The plan was simple: a 3-day hike on the Stevens Ridge Loop, about 27 miles total. I had everything with me: a light tent, food for 4 days, a GPS, a detailed printed map, 2 bottles, a water filter, my knife, first aid kit, extra socks, rain jacket, the usual stuff. I even brought one of those emergency blankets, just in case. I told my coworker Matt where I was going and when I'd be back. He knew the rule: if I didn't check in by Monday evening, call someone. The first day went exactly as planned. I parked at the old forest road where the trail began, locked up my truck, strapped on my pack, and started the loop clockwise. The trail was rugged in places but manageable. I passed through dense pine forests, crossed a few clear streams, and climbed steadily through switchbacks toward the first ridgeline. The views were wide open once I got high enough, stretches of forested valleys and bare rocky peaks in the distance. I pitched camp on a small rise near a dry creek bed, made some pasta, and fell asleep to the wind moving through the trees. On the second day, things started to shift. The map showed that the trail split at a small meadow, then circled back west along the ridge before dropping down toward a lake where I planned to camp. The split came around noon. The main trail was obvious, well-worn, marked by stacked stones and faded plastic ribbons on trees. But next to it was another path, narrower, less traveled, but still clear. The trees were thicker around it, and the path sloped downhill more quickly than I expected. I stopped, checked the GPS, and looked at the paper map. The GPS showed me right near the fork, but the second trail didn't show up on the printed map. I figured maybe it was a shortcut or a maintenance trail. Either way, it looked like it headed toward the same area. I took the narrow path. First, it seemed fine. It wound through thick pines, gradually descending. I kept checking the GPS. It wasn't giving me much help. I was out of cell range, and it just showed my general location, not the trails. After maybe an hour, I realized something was off. The path had started to fade. The dirt turned to loose gravel. Branches scraped against my pack. There were no more markers, no footprints, no signs that anyone had come this way in a long time. I checked the map again. The forest was too thick to make out landmarks, but I figured if I kept heading downhill, I'd eventually hit the lake. It was about 3:30 when I realized I was lost. The trail, if you could still call it that, ended in a dense thicket. I tried pushing through, thinking it would open up again, but it didn't. I stopped, took off my pack, sat on a log, and tried to get my bearings. I looked back the way I'd come, but the path was barely visible. Just scattered pine needles and branches. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I didn't hear birds anymore, just wind and the faint creaking of trees shifting. I wasn't panicking, but I wasn't calm either. I pulled out the GPS again. It gave me coordinates, but that didn't help without signal or a better map. My paper map didn't show anything helpful. I couldn't tell exactly where I was, and I didn't know which direction the actual trail was anymore. I decided to backtrack, follow the faint trail back up the slope, and try to find the fork. That didn't work. After about an hour, the ground started to look unfamiliar. I walked past the same rock twice. A patch of broken branches I was sure I stepped over earlier was suddenly behind me again. I had gotten turned around. The forest felt tight, the trees packed too close, the light starting to dim. I gave up trying to find the trail and decided to make camp early. I picked a flat spot near a cluster of trees, cleared some debris, set up my tent, and ate some jerky and trail mix. I boiled water for tea even though I wasn't in the mood for it. I sat outside until it got too cold, then crawled into my sleeping bag. Sleep didn't come easy. Every snap of a branch outside made me jolt awake. Every gust of wind made me tighten my grip on the knife under my bag. I kept imagining things moving just beyond the thin walls of the tent. When I finally slept, I dreamed of nothing but endless trees and running without knowing what I was running from. By morning, I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up quickly and started hiking downhill, thinking I'd eventually hit a road, stream, or sign of life. I walked for hours. The forest started to change. Less pine, more underbrush, fallen logs, and steep gullies. I scraped my shin climbing over a dead tree and almost fell into a ditch filled with sharp rocks. My hands were scratched. I slipped into a muddy patch and soaked my right boot. Still no sign of a trail. Still no sound except for the occasional caw of a crow. I found a stream around midday. It was narrow, but the water was clear. I refilled my bottles and sat down to rest. I thought about staying near the stream and following it. Water usually leads somewhere, but the stream cut through deep ravines and thick brush. Walking along it would be hard. I followed it anyway. The hours blurred together. I stopped checking the time. I only noticed when the sun dropped and the trees turned golden, then orange, then shadowy gray. I found another flat spot and set up camp again. My hands were shaking when I tried to light my stove. I only managed to eat a little rice before turning in. My legs ached. My shoulders were sore from the pack. My throat felt dry even after drinking water. That night was colder. I wrapped the emergency blanket around my sleeping bag and tried to think about warm things. Home, coffee, even the annoying noises of the city. But the forest outside pressed in from all sides. I heard something walking. Just for a moment, soft footsteps, too heavy for a squirrel, too light for a deer. I held my breath and waited. Nothing happened, just silence. In the morning, I saw prints. Just outside the tent, near where I'd hung my food bag, were tracks. Not boot prints, not animal tracks I recognized. They looked almost like bare feet, wide with spread toes, but they were spaced too far apart. I bent down and stared at them for a long time. Then I packed my gear in silence and started walking again. I was done trying to find the trail. I was just trying to find out. The stream veered into a canyon that I couldn't cross without risking a fall. I climbed back up the slope, hoping for a break in the trees. My boots were worn slick from the wet dirt. My pack dug into my shoulders like a weight I couldn't take off. Every step felt heavier. I hadn't eaten properly in a day and a half. I slipped again, fell hard on my side. The corner of a rock caught my ribs. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. I lay there, staring at the branches above, feeling stupid and angry and scared all at once. My vision blurred. Eventually, I got up and kept moving. That afternoon, I saw something, a clearing ahead, open sky. I ran, branches tearing at my arms. I burst out of the woods and into a dry, open field. A small ridge stretched ahead, with burned tree stumps and ash-covered soil. I knew what that meant. I was in an old fire zone. That was a good sign. Fire crews meant roads, helicopters, people. I climbed the ridge. My legs were cramping, but I pushed forward. And there, far in the distance, I saw something that made me drop to my knees. A narrow line of dirt running along a hillside. A road, a real road. Took me 3 more hours to reach it. The road was empty, cracked, overgrown in places, but it was something. I followed it, limping slightly. Just before sunset, I found a wooden trail sign, mostly faded. It was the old eastern edge of the trail system. I'd wandered nearly 8 miles off course. No wonder the map hadn't helped. I'd gone way beyond the marked routes. I kept walking until I saw the glint of metal. A parked truck. A ranger's vehicle. The ranger wasn't far. He was checking boundary markers, and when he saw me, he froze. I must have looked awful. Covered in scratches, mud-stained clothes, limping and gaunt. He gave me water, let me sit in the passenger seat, and drove me back to the ranger station. I ate crackers and instant soup while someone called in my name. I've been gone 3 days. Matt had already called search and rescue. They were getting ready to start looking the next morning. I spent the night in the ranger station, slept on a cot, and didn't wake up until mid-morning. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My face was sunken. I'd lost weight. My hands were shaking, and I had cuts I didn't even remember getting. But I was alive. They found my original trail the next day and confirmed where I must have turned off. That second trail